Have you ever bought a fancy watch? Maybe a nice car? Upgraded your phone recently? Perhaps your camera? Unless the old one was broken, I'm guessing the new one didn't tell the time any better, get you to work faster, call your friends and family better, or make you a better photographer. But it was probably a new and different experience when you looked at it, interacted with it, drove it, used it in whatever way. I don't actually wear watches anymore, but I used to love getting a new watch. It was fun to choose which watch I felt like wearing on my wrist each day to look at as the day went by. And I still love getting to know a new piece of technology like a smartphone or a computer. It's the discovery that's the fun part for me. Speaking of discovery, that's what science is all about. And yet the heart of discovery is often a long way from what we think of when it comes to data-driven science. Discovery in science often begins as ideas and daydreams that eventually turn into something that can be measured or at least accepted due to a lack of contradictory evidence. I mean, once upon a time, we were certain that the Earth was the centre of the universe. We were also certain that the Earth was flat. But let's not go there. Newton's encounter with an apple led to his theory of gravity, which worked really well until it didn't. And if you want to know what that's all about, then have a look into how Einstein's theory of relativity changed our understanding of gravity. And then there are those who explore and are curious despite ridicule and criticism. Once upon a time, Alfred Wegener proposed that continents were actually floating, and people thought that idea was idiotic. It's what we now call continental drift. Galileo was placed under house arrest for life for suggesting that the Earth actually revolved around the Sun. Gregor Mendel was ignored by his peers when he suggested that traits were being passed down through the seeds of plants and from parents to children. We'd call that genetics today. And then there's Fritz Zwicky, who apparently was not the best person to have to a dinner party or to catch up with for a casual coffee, but it took 40 years for his ideas of dark matter to be accepted as our best current understanding of how the universe all works. And that might yet be proved wrong too. So now let's talk about USB cables. I don't know how they influence the sound, but Newton didn't know why an apple fell from the tree. What I can tell you is that I enjoy trying different USB cables in the same way that I enjoyed having different watches or trying a different car or different smartphone or computer. Each one brings a slightly different listening experience, and I enjoy that journey. If you do too, let's go exploring. What I have here is the AA Audio SG USB cable. It costs about $265 US from AA Audio in Malaysia, and it's the result of many rounds of experimentation, iterations and evolutions by Anwar from AA Audio. Anwar's an engineer who decided after retiring that he wanted to get into building music servers and making USB cables. He's tried different conductor materials for the signal path, the voltage and ground wires. He's also tried different cable thicknesses, and even the plugs he's found make a difference. And you name it, he's tried everything. So this SG cable and the higher spec SIG cable have been literally years in the making. And being an engineer, Anwar's also paying very close attention to USB certifications. So all of his cables meet USB 2 certification, and that means they're going to sit within the accepted range, targeting a 90 ohm impedance for the cable. And so you know with AA Audio cables that you're not buying some random combination of wires that just happens to work. These have been designed to specifications, but also with Anwar's ears to sound the best he can make them sound. And so what that means is that because these meet USB 2 standards, you know they're going to transfer the data in exactly the same way as a USB certified cable. But that only takes us as far as getting the data from point A to point B. It's like having two watches that both tell the time accurately, but I wanted to know if I would enjoy music that's been passed through the SG cable, and whether or not you might enjoy it too. And there's really only one way to find that out. The first test for me was just to put the SG cable up against a generic USB cable that came with a topping DAC. I don't actually know which one, and I honestly wondered if I was going to hear a difference, because if all the specs are the same, surely they should sound the same too. But they don't. Moving from the topping cable to the SG cable from AA Audio, and the first things I noticed was that the sound became a bit more focused. It did make the soundstage feel a little tiny bit more intimate, but I think it was more because each individual instrument got a greater sense of weight, presence and focus to it. The bass became a bit tighter from the SG cable, a little bit less boomy compared to what I was hearing from the topping. The upper mids become a bit more forward, a bit more textured from the SG cable. And then going back, the sound was definitely smoother and less defined from the topping cable. It's probably actually easier to listen to from the topping, but it's less resolving and less detailed. In the track Here by Prince, the SG cable brings out a bit more texture in the synth and a bit more breath in Prince's vocals. Of the two, I personally would choose the SG cable because I enjoy that bit of extra texture, but some people would actually prefer the smoother presentation of the topping cable. That's interesting to me. And so I stepped it up a notch and had a look at the Excalibur cable here from Supra. These come in at around $150 per meter, and they're an excellent kind of entry-level audiophile cable, you could call them. I was using IEMS for a lot of this testing, and I noticed straight away in going to the Excalibur cable after the SG cable that the soundstage kind of pushed right inside my head, remembering I was using IEMS. So if you're using speakers, it just means that the soundstage is going to get a little bit tighter, a little bit closer in, a bit more intimate, you could call it. The other characteristics between these cables were actually a bit more difficult to pick. The soundstage was easy, the rest of it took me a few swaps to isolate what was actually going on. I feel like the Excalibur had slightly tighter bass again, and on this occasion, I think it was the SG cable that was perhaps just a little bit smoother. But I'm saying perhaps and might be here because it was much closer. The difference between the generic topping cable and the SG cable was obvious and significant. The difference between the Excalibur and the SG cable is a little bit more nuanced. As I got my head more around it though, the Excalibur cable brought a character to the sound that was all a bit more controlled, a bit more held down. And so the soundstage comes in, but individual sounds and notes also get tighter, faster and punchier, for better or worse. At the end of it all, I don't really feel like one is vastly superior to the other, and I think it's very much going to be a question of which one you prefer, a bit like watches once again. I personally prefer the slightly more laid-back feel that I get from the SG cable. I like its balance between texture and detail without getting too energetic, but the Excalibur is great and it's only $150. Knowing though that I prefer soundstage size and depth, and that's one of the areas that the SG is stronger than the Excalibur in my opinion, I then turn to the next best USB cable that I've got here, and that's the Curious Evolved USB. This is a much more expensive cable, coming in at about $590 for a 1 meter cable, and the differences here became even more difficult once again. On first listen, I thought the soundstage was a little bit different, I thought the character to the sound was maybe a little bit different as well, but I was less confident on any of those this time than I had been on the Excalibur versus the SG. On the Excalibur versus the SG, the soundstage difference was obvious, the rest took me a bit of time. With the Curious Evolved USB, it took me a lot more time to really nail down the differences. And what I found in the end was that the Curious Evolved does produce greater space in the soundstage. The SG vocal is a bit closer to you, which makes things all feel a bit more intimate, but it's also a bit weightier and a bit more present, which can be really good. The Evolved also presents a sound that's a little bit drier in the top end around the upper mids. That could be a good or bad thing depending on your tastes, and it does mean that through vocals, the SG cable can actually sound a little bit smoother. At this point, I had to start rolling through a bunch of different tracks to start finding differences between these two. Differences that I was confident enough to describe to you and to make sure that this wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. One of the tracks I tried was Digging in the Dirt by Peter Gabriel, the orchestral version. And there's a metronome sound at the beginning of this track that was really clearly differentiating these two cables. On the SG cable, that metronome sounded quite woody. When I went to the Curious Evolved cable, it sounded drier and more textured. The fun thing here is I have no idea what's right. They're just two different presentations that both sound great. When the cellos come in Digging in the Dirt, I also found that they were a bit more rounded, a bit more full-bodied from the SG cable, and again a little bit tighter and more textured from the Curious Evolved. But here's the weird thing. There's some horn blasts that come in around about the 2-minute mark, and those horn blasts were actually more textured and a little bit more attacking in a good way from the SG cable. So it's not just that it's always smoother, it seems that different frequencies are affected differently. And I'm not saying that's the cable changing the frequency response of the audio. What I'm saying is that whatever's going on in the way it's delivering the audio, if it's letting certain sorts of noise through and rejecting other sorts of noise, whatever the cause, it's altering the character of different frequencies differently, and I find that fascinating. I don't know why it's doing it, but it's really interesting. I tried another track, which is this one. And on this track, the Curious Evolve presented a more obvious sense of space and ambience around the instruments. And so on this track alone, I would have chosen the Curious Evolved, but the more I went back and forth between tracks, the more I felt that it was actually a track-dependent thing. I was enjoying the SG cable more on some tracks, I was enjoying the Curious Evolve more on other tracks. And so what does that mean for us that enjoy exploring things like USB cables? Well, what it means is that you could go and buy either of these cables and they're both going to sound great. Unless you're comparing them like I have, you're just going to get a great musical experience. And so you could buy it based on budget. You could buy it based on looks. You could buy it based on the sorts of things I've described here and the fact that overall, I think the Evolve does deliver a little bit more ambience, a little bit more texture, and a sense of forwardness in the upper mids, not excessive forwardness, but just a little bit more dryness and texture up top. Or you could choose the slightly warmer and weightier presentation of the SG cable. And I mean that in terms of the presence and weight that the mid-range has. And so what I'd say for now is that if the SG cable was a watch and I still wore watches, I'd want this one in my collection. At its price, it's an extremely enjoyable addition to a system. I personally think it's just as enjoyable as the Curious Evolved cable, albeit with a slightly different style. The Curious Evolved is a bit fancier to look at if you care about that sort of thing, but at the same time, it's also got this external power wire that I find gets in the way sometimes. The SG doesn't have that. And so as of now, I'm not quite sure where Unwire's up to in terms of international shipping, but watch out. There's some really cool audio gear coming out of Malaysia, and AA Audio might just be leading the charge with their USB cables and their music servers. There's a link below through to AA Audio so you can see what Unwire's up to, what he's producing, and find out when he's ready to ship internationally. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to know my thoughts on the higher level SIG cable from AA Audio, and also Unwire's music servers when they're ready to go global too. As always, a huge thanks to channel members here on YouTube, channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks on your favorite videos here on YouTube. If you're like me and you enjoy exploring audio gear and things like USB cables, then you'll probably enjoy this review up here, which is my take on my current favorite USB cable, the Tubulus Consentus. For now though, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.